All right, diving in today. And this one, wow, this one's, well, let's just say it's caught the eye of some pretty major players. We're talking fooled by randomness. And the sources you sent over, it's a who's who of finance heavyweights.
Yeah, no kidding. You've got Peter Bernstein calling it, what was it, fascinating.
Right, fascinating. And Michael Schrage, he put it up there with, like, the titans, Dawkins, Gould. That's serious intellectual company.
And even Schiller chimed in saying, we need a book like this. That's not something you hear every day.
Not at all. And then you've got, of course, the, market guru himself, Jack Schwager. He put it in his top 5 books on markets ever. That's got to tell you something.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong endorsement. And what's at the heart of it all, what ties it all together, is this idea, this deceptively simple but really profound idea that, well, we humans, we're meaning-making machines, right?
We see patterns, we see connections, we see cause and effect, even when
it might just be, well, randomness, pure chance, just the way the dice rolled.
Exactly. And that's where the fooled part comes in, right? Especially in those areas where we tend to put experts on a pedestal. Finance, economics, those kinds of fields.
Right, because if anyone's got a handle on it, it should be them, right?
Right.
But the author, he really pushes back against that. He wants us to question that assumption.
So what we're going to unpack in this deep dive then is how that tendency, that human tendency to see meaning where there might not be any, can really trip us up. It can distort how we view events, how we make decisions, and especially, like you said, in those areas where we tend to assume expertise equals certainty.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating about this book, and I think why it resonated with the folks at World Trade enough to include it, is that it goes way beyond just finance and economics. It's pulling from, like, ancient history.
Oh, yeah, I noticed that. Ancient history, classical literature, philosophy, it even goes into math and hard science. It's all over the map.
It really is. And for someone like you who's always looking for those connections, those different perspectives, I think this one will really deliver.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. All right, so let's dive in. What really jumped out at me right off the bat was this whole thing about hindsight bias. You know, how looking back, everything seems so obvious, so predictable.
Oh, absolutely. The author talks about this, how he was living it, literally living the book, and realizing how events, things that seemed so random at the time, suddenly felt inevitable in retrospect.
It's like when you listen to someone recount their successes, and it all sounds so, I don't know, so planned out.
Yeah.
But the author, he's saying a lot of that is just narrative, just stories we tell ourselves to make sense of things that we're largely driven by.
Luck.
Right, luck. It makes you wonder how much of what we hear, especially from these so-called experts, is just a well-crafted story after the fact.
Right, and that's what really led the author to this critical and, let's be honest, somewhat controversial view of certain fields, especially conventional economics and the investment world.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. He even uses the word deranged at one point to describe
The level of certainty some people display.
Exactly. And he talks about how resistant some of these folks are to acknowledging uncertainty, to even admitting that luck might play a role.
He tells this great story, actually, about reading a journalist's analysis of a business leader's timing moves. And what struck him wasn't the conclusions the journalist drew, but the journalist's own biases, the assumptions they were making.
It's like they were already working backwards from a conclusion and then just fitting the evidence to the story.
Exactly. And the author is saying, if even experienced journalists can fall into that trap, how can we expect anyone to be truly objective, truly unbiased when it comes to analyzing events? And he brings up those studies, those classic studies about expert predictions, how they often don't learn from past mistakes. They keep making the same errors.
That's a bit worrying, to say the least. So how do we even approach probability then? If we can't trust the experts, if our own brains are wired to see patterns where there might not be any?
Well, the book takes a really interesting approach here. It advocates for a more qualitative understanding of probability.
Qualitative.
Yeah.
As opposed to like the numbers and equations kind of thing.
Exactly. It's almost a literary approach to probability. And the author explicitly contrasts this with the quantitative scientific view, often favored in economics and finance. The kind of thinking that believes you can just plug in the numbers and get a precise answer.
But the real world is a lot messier than that, right?
Much messier, yeah. And the author is saying, be wary of anyone who claims to have it all figured out, who presents their knowledge with absolute certainty. That's a red flag right there.
So it's almost like he's saying Probability is more about accepting that we don't know everything, about acknowledging the limits of our understanding.
Exactly. And then developing strategies to operate within that uncertainty. It's not about finding the right formula. It's about,
Recognizing that there isn't always a right formula.
right, and that real-world problems rarely present themselves in these neat, mathematically defined ways.
So what's the first step then? If we're trying to think probabilistically, what do we do?
The author stresses this over and over again. Consider alternative outcomes. Don't just focus on the most likely scenario.
Think about all the ways things could have gone differently.
Exactly, because the world could have unfolded in countless different ways, and just because one path played out doesn't mean it was the only one or even the most likely one.
Which connects back to Hume, right? The problem of induction. Just because something happened in the past doesn't mean it'll happen again in the future.
Absolutely, and even Aristotle, the whole idea of inferring general principles from specific instances, it's not that simple. There's always room for variation, for unexpected turns.
So probability here is almost like a form of skepticism, right?
Yeah.
A way of questioning our assumptions, recognizing the limits of our knowledge.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the author himself spent his career challenging the purely quantitative use of probability in finance. He's not against math, but he's saying don't let it fool you into thinking you have all the answers.
Which is funny because he actually says the real message of the book is in chapters 13 and 14, which deal with skepticism and stoicism.
Yeah, those are the core philosophical underpinnings of the whole thing.
But what does he say most readers gravitate towards? Chapter 11.
The one with the examples of probability miscalculation.
Love our numbers, don't we?
It seems so. And even in those fields where we assume a deep understanding of probability, like economics, the author is pretty critical.
He's saying there's a lot of surface-level knowledge, but not a lot of genuine practical understanding.
Especially when it comes to dealing with the real world, with all its messiness and unpredictability.
Now, another thing that really stood out to me was his take on the media. He's not exactly pulling any punches there.
Yeah, he's pretty blunt. He basically says a lot of journalism, especially radio and TV, it's more about entertainment than truth-seeking.
Yeah, and he specifically warns us about journalists who think they're deep thinkers. He calls out George Will, which, that's pretty bold.
It is, but his point is these folks often have a platform, they have an audience, and they can shape the narrative in a way that can be really misleading.
And speaking of misleading narratives, he talks about how his own work was sometimes misrepresented in the media.
Yeah, they took his argument that markets are largely random and spun it into a prediction of a market crash.
Which is completely missing the point.
Completely. His whole thing about black swans, those unpredictable events that can have a huge impact, they can be positive too. Randomness can work in your favor.
It's not just about doom and gloom. Now, the book also gets pretty personal at times. I love the anecdote about his first meeting with Robert Schiller.
Oh yeah, the breakfast kennel.
There's even this funny detail about the muffins.
I know, right? He accidentally leaves Schiller with the less appealing option.
But beyond the humor, it really paints Schiller in this very human light.
He comes across as approachable, humble, even charming. It challenges the image you might have of a Nobel laureate.
And what's really interesting is that Schiller actually played a role in shaping the book itself.
He suggested keeping it short, personal, almost like a novel, which is exactly what the author did.
It's amazing how these seemingly random encounters can have such an impact.
Speaking of impact, the author also talks about bubble dynamics, but not in the market, in books.
Book bubbles.
Well, he's talking about how second editions, like the one we're discussing, often do better than the first.
Why is that?
Network effects, basically. The more people know about a book, the more likely others are to buy it. He even mentions Didier Sornet, the physicist, who apparently makes a very convincing case for second editions.
So it's not just about the quality of the content, it's about how many people are talking about it.
Exactly, and he ties this back to the theme of randomness. Sometimes a book's success is driven by factors beyond its control.
Which kind of makes you wonder, what are the hidden forces at play in our own lives?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that are shaping our perceptions, our decisions, that we might not even be aware of?
It's a great question to ponder. And while we're pondering, we should also take a moment to appreciate the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. The author really highlights their significance.
Oh, absolutely. They challenge this whole notion that humans are perfectly rational beings.
23 centuries of dogmatic rationalism out the window.
Gone. Just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Kahneman's work on prospect theory, on how we actually make decisions, It has huge implications for how we think about happiness, even.
Which is another big theme the author touches on throughout the book.
Now, to really get a handle on all this randomness, the author introduces us to the concept of Monte Carlo simulation. It's like a thought experiment, a way of visualizing random events.
He uses it as a metaphor for understanding history and even for creating artificial histories.
Artificial histories, what does that mean?
It's like running simulations, creating these virtual worlds where you can see how events might have unfolded differently.
Kind of like those choose-your-own-adventure books.
Sort of, yeah. The author actually compares it to experimental novels, where the author changes the plot to explore different possibilities.
That's a cool way to think about it.
Yeah.
So with Monte Carlo, you're essentially generating all these different paths history could have taken.
Exactly, and you can see how sensitive the outcome is to random events. You can see how easily things could have gone a different way.
Which is pretty humbling when you think about it.
It is, and the author mentions how he used Monte Carlo extensively in finance. It led him to this idea of summing under histories, which he borrowed from Richard Feynman, the physicist.
So it's not just a theoretical tool, it has practical applications.
Absolutely. But the author is careful to say it's not about getting precise predictions. It's about developing intuition, about understanding the range of possibilities.
It's about expanding our thinking beyond just the most likely scenario.
Exactly. And that brings us to this rather sobering point about our tendency to not learn from history.
Yeah, he makes this great analogy about children needing to touch a hot stove to really understand that it's dangerous.
We often need to experience things firsthand to make our own mistakes, even when all the evidence is right there in front of us.
And he talks about how colleagues who dismissed history, who thought they were smarter than the past,
They often ended up experiencing some pretty spectacular blow-ups, huge financial losses they thought were impossible.
and he points out how before every major market crash, you hear the same refrain. This time is different.
Whether it's 1987, 1990, 1994, or 1998, the dot-com bubble, it's always the same story.
We're so quick to believe we figured it all out that we're immune to the mistakes of the past.
And yet all that knowledge, all those lessons, they're right there in books. It's not a secret.
It's like we're willfully blind to the patterns that are staring us in the face.
And this brings us back to hindsight bias, right? That tendency to judge past decisions based on their outcomes, not on the information that was available at the time.
He gives that example of civil servants looking back at losing trades and calling them gross mistakes.
Even if those trades were perfectly rational given what they knew at the time.
It's so easy to judge in retrospect. We see the outcome, and we assume it was inevitable.
And that's dangerous, because it can lead to this false sense of certainty. We get good at explaining the past, and we start to think we can predict the future.
Like with 9/11, for example. After it happened, it seemed like everyone had a theory about why it was inevitable.
But beforehand, not so much. Our ability to construct a narrative after the fact doesn't mean we had any real foresight.
So how do we avoid that trap? How do we stay humble, stay aware of the limits of our knowledge?
Well, the author turns to a classic source of wisdom here. Solon's warning to Croesus.
Croesus, the king who was so wealthy.
Yes, the one who thought he had it all. And Solon, he was a wise man, a statesman, and he warned Croesus about the fragility of fortune.
He said, "You can't judge a life as happy until it's over. You never know what twists and turns fate might have in store."
And that really resonates with the author because he comes from a family that experienced both extreme wealth and sudden poverty.
He talks about his grandfather, who was a deputy prime minister, ending up in a modest apartment after losing his estate in a war.
It's a powerful image, and it really underscores the author's understanding of how fickle fortune can be.
How quickly things can change, how easily what we think is stable can be swept away.
Exactly, and that's why he emphasizes the importance of distilled thinking. This idea of filtering out the noise, finding the signal amidst the chaos.
And he makes a distinction here between journalism and history, right?
He says, journalism, by its very nature, is often focused on the immediate, the sensational. It tends to overemphasize the significance of current events.
You know, like the market went up today because of whatever the latest headline is.
Exactly, and he says historians, they take a longer view. They try to filter out the noise and see the bigger picture.
But he's worried that historians are becoming more like journalists, more focused on the immediate, the dramatic.
Which can lead to a distorted view of history, a view that emphasizes the role of individual actors in specific events rather than the broader forces at play.
So how does all this talk about randomness, about distilled thinking, how does it apply to our everyday lives?
Well, the author uses this great example of treasury bills, which have a 10% annual volatility.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It means if you look at them day to day, they can fluctuate quite a bit. You can see big swings up and down.
So if you're checking your portfolio every day,
You're going to be on an emotional roller coaster. He even talks about this dentist who sets up a trading desk in his attic and drives himself crazy watching the market every day.
but if you only check your portfolio once a month,
The swings are less dramatic, and if you only look at it once a year, you're likely to see mostly positive results over the long term.
so the frequency with which we observe things, it actually changes our perception of them.
It does, and this is what he calls the scaling property of randomness. The more frequently we expose ourselves to random events, the more volatile they appear, the more emotional we become.
And remember, he also points out that we feel losses more strongly than gains.
So if you're constantly checking your portfolio, you're basically setting yourself up for an emotional deficit.
You're going to be feeling more pain than pleasure, even if you're ultimately making money.
And he even touches on the potential physiological effects of this constant exposure to randomness: increased blood pressure, memory problems, even brain damage.
It's like our bodies aren't designed to handle that level of uncertainty, that level of constant change.
We need some stability, some predictability to function properly.
Now, speaking of different ways of functioning, the author also makes this interesting distinction between scientific and literary intellectuals.
Yeah, he says scientists, especially within a specific field, they can usually recognize each other's work. There's a shared framework, a shared understanding.
But literary intellectuals?
They might have a harder time distinguishing real science from pseudoscience. He even jokes about how they sometimes misuse scientific terms.
And then there's that famous story about Alan Sokal, the physicist who published a completely nonsensical paper in a literary journal.
And the journal accepted it. It's a perfect example of how literary intellectuals can be fooled by randomness, by something that looks like science but isn't.
And there's even software now that can generate meaningless, postmodernist sounding text. You can literally create randomness that sounds profound.
It's pretty amazing, and it really highlights our need for meaning, our desire to find patterns and explanations even where they don't exist.
And the author points out this interesting paradox, how people can be very intellectual about their personal beliefs.
But then totally irrational when it comes to areas like investing, where randomness plays a huge role.
They'll appreciate complex art, but then follow the stock tips they hear from their neighbor.
It's like they switch off their critical thinking skills when it comes to certain domains.
And the book then gives us these really compelling case studies of people who got fooled by randomness in the world of trading. There's the story of Carlos, for example.
Carlos, the emerging market trader, he had early success, but then the Russian debt crisis of 1998 hit, and he lost everything.
What happened?
He got caught up in his own narrative. He had these explanations for why the market was moving the way it was, and he refused to let go of them, even when the evidence was contradicting him.
He violated the cardinal rule of trading. Cut your losses.
His stop-loss orders were just for show. He never intended to actually use them. He was too convinced he was right.
It's like he thought he was immune to the forces of randomness, that he could somehow outsmart the market.
And then there's John, the high-yield trader.
What was his story?
He made a ton of money really quickly by using a lot of leverage and these complex hedging strategies.
He was like a financial wizard.
That's what it looked like. But the author points out that he hadn't actually been through a full market cycle. He'd never experienced a truly extreme event.
So it was like he was playing Russian roulette.
Exactly. The author even uses that analogy. He was making steady gains, but he was exposed to this huge hidden risk. It was only a matter of time before something unpredictable happened and wiped him out.
Which brings us to the crucial point about considering alternative histories.
He uses the Russian roulette example to really drive this home. If you win at Russian roulette, you might think you're a genius.
But you're just lucky.
Exactly, and the author contrasts this with someone who makes $10 million through dentistry.
Okay, so it's same outcome, but
Very different levels of risk. The dentist is relying on skill and consistency. The Russian roulette player is relying on pure chance.
And the author points out that even philosophers have grappled with this idea of alternative histories. He mentions Leibniz's concept of possible worlds.
It's a fascinating philosophical concept, and it really underscores the importance of considering all the paths that could have led to our present moment.
Which brings us to the paradox of expertise. The author talks about this influx of scientists, especially physicists, into finance in the early 90s.
These were brilliant people with incredible mathematical skills, but they often struggled in the real world of finance.
Why is that?
They had a hard time adapting their theoretical knowledge to the messiness and unpredictability of markets. They lacked a certain practical intelligence.
It's like they were trying to apply a formula to something that doesn't fit in a formula.
Exactly, and the author contrasts this with people who have MBAs. They might not have the same level of mathematical sophistication.
But they have a better understanding of how the real world works, of how people actually make decisions.
And sometimes that practical knowledge is more valuable than theoretical brilliance.
Especially in a field like finance, where psychology plays such a huge role.
Absolutely. And speaking of psychology, we can't forget the media's role in shaping our perceptions of risk.
The author is pretty critical of how the media presents risk, isn't he?
He is, yeah. He says they tend to sensationalize certain types of risks, like plane crashes or terrorist attacks, because they're more dramatic, more attention-grabbing.
But statistically, those risks are actually quite low.
Much lower than things like car accidents or heart disease.
But those don't make for good headlines, right?
Not really, and the author says this creates a distorted view of risk in our minds. We end up fearing the wrong things.
He also points out how the media tends to view market downturns as more volatile than equally large increases.
It's like they're framing it as a crisis, even when it might just be a normal market correction.
And the language they use, the tone of their reporting, it all contributes to this sense of anxiety and fear.
It's like they're trying to keep us on edge, keep us glued to the screen.
So where does Monte Carlo fit into all of this? We talked about it earlier as a metaphor, but how do we actually use it?
The author reiterates that it's not a crystal ball. It's not about getting precise predictions.
It's about exploring possibilities, understanding the range of potential outcomes.
Exactly. And he stresses the importance of viewing mathematics, including Monte Carlo, as a way of thinking, not just as a set of tools.
It's about developing a probabilistic mindset, a way of seeing the world in terms of chance and uncertainty.
And that can be emotionally challenging because our brains naturally crave certainty, they crave explanations.
He talks about how looking too closely at randomness can actually lead to emotional burnout.
All those little ups and downs, those constant fluctuations, they wear us down. And remember, we feel losses more strongly than gains.
So even if you're ultimately winning, the emotional toll can be significant.
And he even mentions the potential physiological effects of this constant exposure to uncertainty. Stress, memory problems, even brain damage.
It's like our bodies aren't built for this kind of information overload.
We need some downtime, some predictability to recharge and recover.
Now, speaking of our limitations, the author really dives into the ways our brains are wired to be fooled by randomness.
He says we're pattern-seeking machines. We're constantly trying to find connections to make sense of the world.
Which is a useful skill in many contexts, right?
Absolutely. But it can also lead us astray when dealing with random events. We see patterns where there are none. We invent explanations where there are no explanations to be found.
He even says our brains are probability blind.
We tend to overestimate the likelihood of the most likely scenario and underestimate the possibility of rare events.
Which is why we're so often surprised by black swans.
Exactly, and it's emotionally difficult to truly act as if we're ignorant, to reject our hypotheses even when we're attached to them.
It's like we'd rather be wrong with conviction than right with uncertainty.
And this brings us to the whole field of heuristics and biases, which Kahneman and Tversky really pioneered.
They showed how our brains use these mental shortcuts to make decisions, and those shortcuts often lead to systematic errors.
The author gives all sorts of examples of these biases, and he even connects them to the language traders use, like, I'm only as good as my last trade, which is a classic example of the anchoring bias.
Anchoring, what does that mean?
It means we tend to get fixated on a certain piece of information, even if it's irrelevant, and it influences our judgments.
Like if you ask someone to estimate the population of a city, and you first give them a random number, like 10 million.
Their estimate is likely to be closer to 10 million, even if they know it's wrong.
That's wild. And then there's the representativeness heuristic, which is about how we judge things based on how well they fit a certain category.
Like if you meet someone who's quiet and introspective, you might assume they're a librarian, even though statistically there are far more accountants than librarians.
So we're relying on stereotypes instead of actual probabilities.
Exactly. And the author ties all of this back to Kahneman's two systems of thinking. System 1 is fast, intuitive, emotional. System 2 is slower, more deliberate, logical.
And most of these biases, they come from system one, right?
Right, it's our gut reactions, our snap judgments that often lead us astray.
But he also points out that system one can be trained. With experience, our intuition can become more refined, more accurate.
It's like learning to play a musical instrument. At first, you have to think about every note, but eventually it becomes second nature.
Now, there's another perspective on all of this from the field of evolutionary psychology.
They take a slightly different view, arguing that our cognitive limitations aren't bugs, they're features.
What do they mean by that?
They say our brains evolved to solve the problems of our ancestors, not the problems of the modern world. So it's not surprising that we struggle with things like probability, which were largely irrelevant to our hunter-gatherer forefathers.
As Steven Pinker put it, our brains are made for fitness, not for truth.
Exactly. And they even argue that some of the heuristics we use, which traditional psychology views as errors, are actually examples of ecological rationality. They're shortcuts that were effective in our ancestral environment.
So what might seem like a flaw in our thinking could actually be an adaptation.
Precisely. And it's a really interesting way to reframe these cognitive biases.
Now, the book even goes into the realm of law and justice, and how our understanding of probability, or lack thereof, can have real consequences.
He uses the O.J. Simpson trial as an example. It was this high-profile case, and there were all these misunderstandings about probability, about what the evidence actually meant.
Like the whole thing about the bloody glove.
Exactly, and the author says this happens all the time in legal cases. People misinterpret probabilities, they misinterpret evidence, and it can lead to wrongful convictions.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is, and he says, in simpler societies, maybe our intuition is good enough. But in the complex world we live in today, we need a better grasp of probability.
Especially when it comes to decisions that affect people's lives.
Absolutely. And another area where probability often gets misunderstood is in the concept of expected value.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like buying a stock option. There's a high probability that the option will expire worthless, but there's also a small probability of a huge payoff.
So how do you calculate the expected value?
You multiply the potential payoff by the probability of it happening, and you subtract the cost of the option. And even though the most likely outcome is 0, the expected value can still be positive.
So it's not just about the most likely scenario. It's about weighing all the possibilities, even the unlikely ones.
Exactly, and this gets to another common fallacy. The confusion between absence of evidence and evidence of absence.
What's the difference?
Well, let's say there's a new chemotherapy drug, and a study shows no statistically significant improvement in survival rates. That doesn't mean the drug doesn't work. It just means the study didn't find conclusive evidence that it works.
But it's easy to misinterpret that.
Very easy. Journalists might report it as drug found to be ineffective, and even doctors might dismiss it. But all it really means is we need more research.
So just because we haven't found evidence for something doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the constant barrage of explanations we get from the media, especially when it comes to financial markets.
The author makes fun of those financial commentators who always have an explanation for every market move, even if it's just random noise.
He compares it to a close bicycle race. The cyclists are all bunched up, and they're constantly jostling for position. But in the end, the winner might just be the one who got a lucky break.
So all that analysis, all that commentary, it might just be noise.
It might be, yeah. And our brains have a hard time filtering that noise out. We want explanations. We want to believe there's a reason for everything.
But sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's just randomness.
Exactly. And the author, he's aware of his own tendency to see patterns, even where they might not exist. He talks about this cab ride he once took, which happened to coincide with a profitable trading day.
So he started associating cab rides with good luck.
Well, not quite, but he's aware of the temptation to do that. He even admits to having some mild superstitions himself, which he attributes to his cultural background.
And he mentions B.F. Skinner's experiments with pigeons.
Where the pigeons developed these elaborate rituals because they thought they were causing the food to appear, even though it was completely random.
So even animals can be fooled by randomness.
It seems so, and the author is saying this is just part of our nature. We want to believe we have control, even when we don't.
Which brings us to Carneades, the Greek skeptic philosopher. He's a really interesting character.
He was a master of argument, but he refused to commit to any particular doctrine or belief. He believed in constantly questioning everything.
He even went to Rome. and gave these speeches where he argued both sides of every issue.
Which apparently really annoyed the Romans. They ended up kicking him out.
So he was a bit too skeptical for their liking.
It seems so, but the author sees him as a role model. He says we should all be more like Carniers, more willing to question our assumptions, to embrace uncertainty.
Especially in a world that's constantly changing, where what we think we know can become obsolete overnight.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with the modern aversion to self-contradiction. We're so afraid of appearing inconsistent, of changing our minds.
But he says changing your mind can actually be a sign of intellectual honesty.
He even mentions a character from Proust, Monsieur de Norpois, who would contradict himself all the time without even realizing it.